out at the beach and your ex-old lady suddenly out of nowhere shows up with a story about her current billionaire land developer boyfriend and his wife and her boyfriend and a plot to kidnap the billionaire and throw him in a loony bin.
I need your help, Doc.
Maybe you should just look the other way.
So this weekend I saw Inherent Vice and I have no fucking clue what was going on. Anyone who says they got it is a liar. And yet at the same time I think I kind of love this. Inherent Vice is the new film from Wes Anderson, Paul W.S. Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson. I remember a while back having a conversation with some friends about who has been our favourite director since we've been alive, and my choice was all PTA. What I always thought the great thing about his career was that you see a development of his changing style over the course of his filmography. His early work is much more comedy driven with ensemble casts, whereas his later work became smaller in scope and the tone became similar to that of a Kubrick or a Terrence Malick project. Inherent Vice feels like a hybrid of all his previous work, and I think the best way to talk about the movie is how it compares to the director's other films, simply because this is a very difficult thing to talk about otherwise. Anderson has never been a director that was always big on story, but me explaining the story of Inherent Vice would be about as useful as a dick-flavoured lollipop. It's normally around this point that I'd give a brief plot summary of the movie, but an essential aspect to the plot is that you don't get it. It's intentionally incoherent and there are so many plot threads that you'll never keep up. I could just about keep up with the basic narrative, but even though the structure was all over the place, I was always interested in what was going to happen next.
I never remember plots of movies. I remember how they make me feel. I remember emotions and I remember visual things that I've seen.
The movie is utterly nonsensical, and although I enjoyed it, I'm sure that many people may just become infuriated with how convoluted this is. It's a really difficult one to explain, but the best comparison that I can use is that it feels as though it was made in the same spirit as some of the Coens comedies, particularly The Big Lebowski and A Serious Man. In all these films, we follow an oddball character through various implausible situations as they try to link their odd circumstances together. But ultimately, does it really matter? You could try and decipher the web of Inherent Vice, our main character does, but it's more about being disjointed. In my opinion, the movie is about American culture at the dawn of the 70s. The hippie movement is dying out and people are going through a strange transitional period. Everyone is paranoid and trying to make sense of what's going on around them, but the answer is probably simpler than we think. To be honest, I'm more intrigued to hear what other people make of it. If you are able to accept the style that the film is aiming for, you may really like this. However, if you're just expecting a typical screwball comedy, then you may be disappointed. Which is unfortunate because even as a comedy, this movie works really well. I found it consistently pretty funny, and that was thanks to some really humorous performances and some great visual comedy. See, regardless of what your opinion is on a Paul Thomas Anderson movie, it's difficult to deny that his direction isn't good, and he seems to continually get the best out of his actors. And in this, all the actors were great. Come to think of it, there wasn't one bad performance, which is amazing considering just how many people are in this. Also, for a while, I thought the characters were just caricatures, yet later in the film there are hints towards some depth which begs to be delved into. The majority of the cast is just played for laughs, but there is something more in the three main characters, which I think added a bit more to my enjoyment of the flick. As for the look of the movie, it's not as astounding as Anderson's most recent works, but it's still more visually interesting than most stuff that's released. Although it would have been nice to see what the crew could have done with the natural landscape. The characters completely embody that California lifestyle, and the state seems to be a haven for filmic imagery. Considering Anderson's eye for cinematography and how reflective the characters are of the epoch that they inhabit, you'd think that this would be a chance to capture some really cool stuff. It's not an issue with the movie, just something I would like to have seen. And an important thing to take note of when watching Inherent Vice is that it's based off the eponymous novel by Thomas Pynchon. Now, I'm only familiar with who Thomas Pynchon is, but I've never read any of his work, although I have heard that he can be quite the polarising author, and it's not difficult to imagine after seeing this. And whilst watching this, that sense of adaptation really does hit you quite hard because it does have the feel of a novel, and some of the dialogue, punchy though it was, does feel directly lifted from the source material. And I guess that's everything I have to say about Inherent Vice. This is a really tough film to talk about because you can't discuss this film with someone who hasn't seen it. Typically I can suggest a movie based on people's preferences, but with this it's so heavily reliant on people's interpretation of what's going on, and seeing how there's a lot of room for said interpretation, it's the kind of film in which everyone's watching experience will be vastly different. All the critiques and comments I have about the movie sound as though they should be negative, but they aren't. The film did feel quite long, yet at the same time I wouldn't have minded if I could see a bit more. is just such a peculiar picture. I mean, we all know the key rule for filmmaking is show, don't tell. Yet the movie effectively does a 180 and goes completely against that. Every scene is an exposition dump where people just walk into a room and talk to one another. But somehow they pull it off. It's not a flawless film by any means. In the final act of the movie, the tone does become a bit confusing. It's very cartoony throughout, yet towards the end there are a handful of scenes that take a really serious tone and it seemed a bit out of place. But that aside, I thought this was a fantastic film. I absolutely get why the reviews of this are very mixed, and I couldn't even recommend it to everyone. However, if you're interested in seeing a unique take on film structure and form, then check it out. It's definitely one that needs to be watched multiple times, but I for one am more than happy enough to do just that. I'm giving Inherent Vice an 8.5 out of 10.
What a wonderful world this would be.